Hello and welcome to today's ongoing formation session. Today, Bridget Durham is going to be speaking about Pope Francis's latest encyclical letter entitled Fratelli Tutti. So Bridget.
Hi everybody, thanks Amy. I was so excited that as we approach the feast day of our Blessed Father, Saint Francis, our Holy Father, Pope Francis, was on his way to Assisi to sign his latest encyclical letter on universal fraternity and social friendship called Fratelli Tutti. So Fratelli Tutti means all brothers and sisters. As secular Franciscans, fraternity is so close to our hearts and embedded deeply into our way of living out our vocation. And as we know, several articles of our rule mention how to live in fraternity and the importance of fraternity. I believe Pope Francis's desire in writing Fratelli Tutti was that by acknowledging the dignity of each person, no matter their location, we can all contribute to a birth of universal fraternity. There's so much good news and guidance from Pope Francis in this encyclical that I could never cover it today. So I want to show a brief 5-minute video that highlights some of the main themes and chapters in Fratelli Tutti. And then I will dive in a little more deeper into it the best way that I could think of. So I'm going to show you a video that was put out by the Vatican. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Here we go. As you can see, like each of the numbers in the video were the title of each of the chapters. One that particularly sticks out to me is the title of chapter 3, Envisioning and Engendering an Open Society. And I just loved how he says engendering an open society, and how it really has to become part of who we are to live the vision and value of universal fraternity. And our Franciscan charism, so much of it is just spelled out for us right here in this encyclical. One of the great things about Pope Francis is that his writing is very accessible. So I would just encourage everybody to read the encyclical, even if you can just do a chapter at a time, but make the time to do it. Take it into your prayer life and contemplate how you can live or develop universal fraternity. So as he did with his previous encyclical, Laudato Si, which was on care for a common home, Pope Francis starts Fratelli Tutti with a big, huge shout out to his namesake and our patron and guide, St. Francis of Assisi. So if you may recall that when the votes were being cast and Jorge Bergoglio was about to become the next pope, his cardinal friend from Brazil whispered in his ear, "Don't forget the poor." And that was the inspiration for him to take the name Francis after St. Francis of Assisi, because of his work for peace and for the poor. And Pope Francis has remained faithful to this call, and it continues to inspire him in how he desires a poor church for the poor. Pope Francis also reminds us that St. Francis is a saint of fraternal love, simplicity, and joy. A fraternal love that transcends geography and distance, and in the words of St. Francis, declares blessed all those who love their brothers as much as when he is far away from him as when he is with him. Wherever he went, St. Francis sowed seeds of peace and walked alongside the poor, the abandoned, the affirmed, and the outcast, the least of the brothers and sisters. And if you remember, I think it was a couple months ago, we did our ongoing formation. We went through the themes of Catholic social teaching, and we talked about that word, the Anoim, that Jesus used in the Gospels about the outcast. And so St. Francis, of course, being so much like Jesus, also walked along and cared for those on the outcast of society. And Pope Francis also writes about an event that we are all very familiar with, and that is St. Francis's visit to the Sultan, Malik al-Kamil in Egypt, undertaken in the time of the Crusades. This journey, Pope Francis says, demonstrates the breadth and grandeur of St. Francis's love, which sought to embrace everyone, while unconcerned for his own hardships. So St. Francis was able to find himself among the Saracens, not there to argue, but to be subject to every human creature for the sake of God. He did not wage a war of words, but he simply spread the love of God. St. Francis was able to welcome a true peace in his heart and free himself from the desire for power. And again, he is the inspiration for Fratelli Tutti. So following along that same theme, Pope Francis mentions another source of encouragement for undertaking this encyclical, and that is the Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Taib, who he met with in Abu Dhabi. Just as Laudato Si was inspired by working with the Orthodox Patriarch Bartholomew, who he calls his brother, Fratelli Tutti is also inspired by the Grand Imam, who he also considers his brother. Pope Francis, like St. Francis, does not shy away from embracing everyone. And the Grand Imam on his Twitter even tweeted, and I'm quoting his tweet, "My brother, Pope Francis's message, Fratelli Tutti, reveals a global reality in which the vulnerable and marginalized pay the price for unstable positions and decisions. It is a message that is directed to people of goodwill, whose consciences are alive and restores humanity's consciousness." So if you have Twitter or other social media accounts, you can follow the hashtag Fratelli Tutti and find many quotes and reflections from various people. on the encyclical. Another thing that's important to mention, I think, is that Fratelli Tutti was written during this global pandemic of the SARS-CoV-2, which of course we can all relate to. Pope Francis reminds us that this pandemic has also exposed to us a kind of a false sense of security. The inability of many countries to work together in the face of the pandemic quickly became evident despite our hyperconnectivity. This fragmentation we witnessed makes it more difficult to resolve problems that affect all of humanity. This tragic pandemic, Pope Francis says, helped us realize that in fact we are all in the same boat, and one person's problem is a problem for all of us. The global community has to work together now to be saved together from the pandemic. And so if you did read Laudato Si or studied Laudato Si, and that came out in 2015, I think, you'll see that some of the same themes are carried over. So to name a few I listed here: throwaway culture, poverty, war. You can read the bullet points. These are themes that are all near and dear to the heart of Pope Francis. These themes that, that show topics and areas of where societal repair is needed. So since they are so close to the heart of Pope Francis, it makes sense that he's going to carry these themes through his papacy. Pope Francis says the inability or refusal to sit down and really listen attentively to others creates a deaf world. When we do engage in personal conversation, are we attentively listening, or halfway through, are we ready to contradict and state our own position? So something to remember: attentive listening, so very important. Pope Francis reminds us that to achieve universal fraternity and social friendship, we must not lose our ability to listen. So recall that St. Francis, through attentive listening, heard the voice of God. He heard the voice of the poor, the voice of nature, and he allowed that to transform his life through his attentive listening. So God continues to sow abundant seeds of goodness in our human family. We just need to look and listen. As I said before, there's no way I could do justice to the entire encyclical Fratelli Tutti by trying to cover it all today. So I decided to talk specifically about how Pope Francis uses the parable of the Good Samaritan to demonstrate his point and help us understand fraternity a little better, hopefully. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, of course, you know that one, Jesus tells the story of the man assaulted and lying injured on the roadside, and how people who were in high social positions failed to stop. So really, they could not step away from what they considered their importance in society to take time for the injured man, or to even spend their own money to help make sure he was cared for. The only person that stopped, as Pope Francis says, gave something that we cling to so tightly in our frantic world. He gave his time. Because of course the Samaritan was also on his way somewhere, just like the priest, the Levite, yet he put aside his time in order to be of service to a person in need. So I want to show another brief video put out by the Church of Latter-day Saints that demonstrates the parable of the Good Samaritan in modern times. So bear with me one more second and I'll get that set up. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, here we go.
Please, stop. No, please. Please. No change, I'm sorry. No. Please. I'm not trying, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. I didn't. Thank you, sweetheart. Good luck on your first day, Mama.
Thank you, boys. Hope your boys get ready for school, eh? I'll be late. I must go now.
Thank you. Bye. I knew he was gonna unlock the food bank at 7. Just make sure the volunteers know what's going on, okay? Okay, I'll call you back.
Jason, what's going on, son? What about our meds? Okay, tell Mom that I'll be there and I'll try to get back for my 1 o'clock. Guys, come on. Hit the wall. Go. I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh. I'm so sorry. I didn't even mean to. Yeah. I'm almost there.
It's okay. It's okay. Come. I know a place.
It'll probably be about a 20-minute wait.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll call later to make sure it's okay. What's your number?
Oh,
Thank you. I must go now. Finish up. No, please.
Okay.
Please.
Thank you. Come in.
Good morning, sir.
Oh, there you are. I was wondering what happened to you.
My apologies, sir.
Well, I'm glad you made it in. Let me call down to the floor and see where they need you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Hey, John, it's Matt. New gal's here. Do you want her in receiving or?
So I hope you enjoyed that video. I think it really does justice to showing in today's world, how we may encounter these situations that are told through the parable. So really the context of the parable of the Good Samaritan is human relationships. Pope Francis reminds us in Fratelli Tutti that really shortly after the creation of the world and of humanity, the Bible takes up the theme of human relationship. You know, we read right then that Cain kills Abel, and then we hear God ask, "Where is your brother?" And of course, the answer is one that can be all too familiar to us. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, I say yes, we absolutely are our brothers and sisters' keeper. But by asking, "Where is your brother?" God encourages us to create a culture in which we care for one another. And then, of course, this theme of human relationships is carried out through the entire Old and New Testaments. It's in the Jewish traditions, our early church communities, our early church fathers, and saints across the ages. It's nothing new, but yet it does seem to fall by the wayside, just like the man assaulted by the thieves in the parable of the Good Samaritan. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis asks us whom we identify with in the parable. What characters do we resemble? So the characters of the story begin with the robbers, but as we know, Jesus decided to start the parable after the crime had taken place. We know robbers of today very well, if we think about it. You know, neglect and violence in the name of power and division, to name a couple. But these are the types of robbers that find allies in those who pass by and look the other way, or those who are disillusioned and in despair over the thought that everything is broken in the system anyway. So Pope Francis asks us again, will we abandon the injured man running to take refuge from the violence, or will we pursue the robber? Next, he asks us to look at the passers-by. Pope Francis names the nervous indifference that lead passers-by to the other side of the road as an indifference to our neighbors and events that do not personally affect us. Like when I was thinking about that, I was kind of thinking climate change, for example, because I know and hear so many times that people say things like, well, it's snowing and freezing in my town, so global warming or climate change, you know, is not real because it's not affecting me specifically. So that's kind of how I understand that indifference, that if I don't see and feel it, then it doesn't exist or it doesn't matter. I think that's what he's talking about. Pope Francis says, though, that there are many ways we pass by. We can retreat inwards, we can ignore others, of course have indifference to the poor, whose pleas for help may not simply exist in our indifference. One thing he does point out is that the passers-by are religious, and that is a detail we should not overlook. It shows, you know, that belief and worship of God really are not enough to ensure that we are living our lives in a pleasing way to God. The Holy Father, Pope Francis, says the guarantee of an authentic openness to God is in a way of practicing the faith that opens our hearts to our brothers and sisters. You could, if you had noticed, I hope you could hear in the video, but the gentleman was on the way to Mass, and he didn't put his attendance at the Mass. He put that above helping the injured man on the road. So I think that's kind of what Pope Francis is talking about, in that is how are we living our faith in a pleasing way to God? And he would tell us that it's having our hearts open to our brothers and sisters. So we have these situations in our everyday world now. We find injured people, you know, people assaulted in the streets, hit and run accidents, bullying, racism, natural disasters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm talking really both local and global events that happen. But how many times have we turned the other way to avoid the problem because we're caught up in our own lives or our own problems? Pope Francis would point out that this is a symptom of an unhealthy society, one that turns its back on suffering until it affects us directly. He is asking us to rediscover our vocation as citizens of the entire world. So we look at the passerby and why they passed to the other side of the road. Was it disdain or distraction? Their own thoughts. That's something that we can really take into contemplation, into our prayer life. And if we ask ourselves why, we may pass by. Next, Pope Francis has us look at the injured man. And of course, there are times where we've all felt like the injured person, I imagine, badly hurt and left alone. We can also feel helpless because our institutions that can help society might be neglected, or they might lack resources, or they only serve a certain demographic at certain times of the day, you know, things like that. There's also a way that the global society can look at those who are injured and suffer really without ever being in touch with them. And that kind of happens when we see newscasts or photos online, you know, and that may bring us to feel real empathy, but we never have a true encounter with someone, a stranger or an injured man in their suffering. So Pope Francis is trying to encourage us to draw into human relationship and real encounter. But of course, every day offers us a new opportunity to have a new chance to not be the passerby. The Good Samaritan in the parable finds the innkeeper. And they kind of united like as family, as fraternity, so to speak, to help the injured man together. This is why I believe Pope Francis is urging us to build a universal fraternity so that together we can help those who are most suffering. It's a decision we really face every day, honestly, probably, to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders. And Pope Francis says, really, in all honesty, we all have something of each character in ourselves. The wounded man, the robber, the passerby, and of course, the Good Samaritan. And the hope, you know, is that the Good Samaritan will inspire us to put our time and compassion into building a more fraternal world, one in which our labels fall away and we bend down to help those in need. So, you know, the parable was told because Jesus was first asked, who is my neighbor? And in Jesus's time, that would have meant, you know, like those physically close to them, or those in their own race or religious group. But in this parable, Jesus asks us to become neighbors to all, to everyone, to be present to those in need of help, regardless of what social group they belong to. And then, of course, also remember, he ends the parable with go and do likewise, meaning put away our differences and draw near to each other with no questions asked. The parable gives us, you know, the basic decision that we're called to make in order to rebuild the wounded world. This is the moment of truth, he says. Will we all bend down to touch the wounds of others, to help another get up? And really, our only right choice is to imitate the Good Samaritan. Any other decision makes us the thief or the one who passed by without compassion. So here, I'm going to jump ahead several chapters, in paragraphs, because I want to touch briefly on chapter 6. Chapter 6 is titled Dialogue and Friendship in Society. And I think this is so very important. A few years ago, I did a brief little talk on dialogue in fraternity at the regional retreat, if any of you remember that. And also I want to point out that Article 19 of our Rule of Life calls us to, quote, seek out ways of unity and fraternal harmony through dialogue. It's so super important. So in this chapter of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis talks about approaching, speaking, listening, looking at, coming to know and understand one another, finding common ground. All of these are summed up in the word dialogue. He says that unlike conflict and disagreement that make big news headlines, persistent and courteous dialogue does quietly take place and helps the world to live much better than we can imagine. And I mean, and what an exciting vision. A world much better than we can imagine, all by simple dialoguing with each other. You know, between the indifference and violent protests, there's always another option, he says, and that's dialogue. Between generations, among all peoples, between the cultural components, so like the popular culture, the youth culture, the artistic and technological cultures, all these cultures that we find ourselves living in, all of these have room for dialogue and encounter with each other. And sometimes dialogue can be confused with something that's quite different. And that would be a feverish exchange of opinions. And a lot of times it happens on social networks, more so these days. But these types of exchanges really, Pope Francis says, are parallel monologues. And these monologues are not engaging anyone, not bringing together anyone. They are an obstacle to real dialogue when everyone clings tightly to our own ideas and interests. And unfortunately, these types of monologues have become part of our daily conversations. But authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit to ourselves that they may include legitimate convictions and concerns. Others do have points to make, and it's our place as fraternity to be attentive and listen and share authentically. Pope Francis says that in the true spirit of dialogue, we grow in our ability to grasp the significance of what others say and do, even if we cannot accept it as our own conviction. But in this way, it is possible to be open and frank about our beliefs while still continuing to dialogue and hold on to what we believe as true. But we seek points of contact, and above all, we work and struggle together. So that's a point of dialogue. At the end of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis mentions the people who inspired him. Particularly, of course, he had mentioned St. Francis of Assisi, but also he pointed out Dr. Martin Luther King, Desmond Tutu, Gandhi, and many others. But he does take special note of Blessed Charles de Foucauld, whose deep faith and experience of God led him to a journey of transformation as a brother to all. So some of you may be familiar with Blessed Charles, but he directed his total surrender to God toward identification with the poor, kind of like St. Francis. He moved and lived among the poor and abandoned in the desert of Africa. He expressed his desire to feel himself a brother to every human being. The prayer that Blessed Charles asked of his friends was that he truly become a brother to all. And then, of course, by identifying with the least, he did at last become a brother to all. That's Universal Fraternity. So this is where I'm going to leave off with a reminder that in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis reminds us that the dignity of others is to be respected in all circumstances, not because it's something that we have invented or imagined, but because human beings possess an intrinsic worth far superior to that of any material, objects, or situations. Every human being possesses an inalienable dignity, and that's a truth that corresponds to our human nature for all of us. So with that in mind, it might be easier to imagine the joys and challenges of a universal fraternity that Pope Francis calls us to. So let's close with Pope Francis's prayer to the Creator at the end of Fratelli Tutti. Lord, Father of our human family, you created all human beings equal in dignity. Pour forth into our hearts a fraternal spirit and inspire in us a dream of renewed encounter, dialogue, justice, and peace. Move us to create healthier societies and a more dignified world. A world without hunger, poverty, violence, and war. May our hearts be open to all the peoples and nations of the earth. May we recognize the goodness and beauty that you have sown in each of us, and thus forge bonds of unity, common projects, and shared dreams. Amen. So with that, again, I would just encourage you to find Fratelli Tutti. You can find it online. I believe it'll be coming out in print soon. You can get a copy, and yeah, take time, pray with it, sit with it, and you'll see how much of our Franciscan charism is in Fratelli Tutti. So with that, thank you, and I'll hand it back to Amy.
Thank you, Bridget.
You're welcome.
That was terrific. And we will be posting this on our YouTube channel for all the world to see. Thank you. Have a wonderful week.
Bye-bye.
God bless you.
Bye.